given the performance we had and the challenges we faced, P2 is a really good result. And so the mood this week is really one of happiness and relief at having delivered that P2. Did the team expect a two-stop race, given it's usually been a one-stop strategy? Well, you're right, traditionally Abu Dhabi's always been a one-stop, but that really changed in 2021 with the new layout. That does two things. The first thing is it puts a lot more load through the tyres, increasing the degradation. But secondly, the additional overtaking opportunities mean that it's much harder for the drivers to focus on managing their tyres because they need to be thinking much more about defending their position. So if you look back to last year, it was a mixture of one and two stop strategies, and that's what we expected and what we saw this year. If we had our time again, knowing what we know now, then I think most people would target a one-stop race very similar to Sonoda. But at the time, we felt that that was quite a risky proposition, and what we needed to focus on was getting ahead of the McLarens and finishing close enough to Ferrari to secure that P2 in the championship. And the low-risk way of doing that was to follow suit and commit to the two-stop as other cars did too. What damage did Lewis's car sustain after the incident with Gasly? Well, these things often look worse on television than they are in reality and in the data. And undoubtedly it will have affected the balance and the performance of Lewis's car slightly, but it was never a consideration for us to pay the cost of a pit stop of fitting a new front wing versus just continuing with it. Actually, the biggest concern for us was structural. So if it had degraded and started to become a structural concern, then that might have been a safety issue and that might have forced us to change it. We were monitoring it very closely during the race, but thankfully that never became an issue and he could just complete the race with the wing as it was. What were the reasons Lewis wasn't as quick in the third stint on the hard tyre? Well, actually, if you pick through the data and correct for things like the age of tyres, the track condition, Lewis's performance was actually pretty similar through stint 2 and stint 3, but the race situation made it look quite different. In stint 2, Lewis was on fresh tyres chasing down Fernando, whereas Fernando was on older tyres and spent most of that stint in the dirty air of Piastri. That makes Fernando's performance look worse than it is in reality, and Lewis therefore looks stronger. Take stint 3 and the positions were reversed. Fernando had slightly newer tyres than Lewis and fresh air, and Lewis was in the dirty air of Fernando with the older tyres. And so that's why his performance doesn't look as impressive despite the lap times being quite similar. The other thing to be aware of is that Lewis was managing a brake issue throughout the race, which was a real reliability concern. So our number one priority was making sure that we got that car to the finish and didn't have to retire it. That will have affected his performance to varying degrees throughout the race, and is something that we're certainly working on to improve for next year's car. Is George okay? He was coughing a lot in the car. Yeah, George is fine. So it's been a really tough season and a particularly gruelling run-in, and quite a few of us are feeling fairly under the weather. However, unlike George, most of us don't have to sit in a Formula 1 car being subjected to the kind of forces that he experiences for 58 laps of the race. I suspect that was a very unpleasant and uncomfortable experience, and it's all the more impressive that he was able to deliver that P3 result. Hopefully now he's got a bit of time to rest and relax, and he'll be feeling much better soon. How's the mood in the factory going into the winter? Well, ultimately, the aim of all of us here is to win championships, and we weren't able to deliver that this year. However, given the performance we had and the challenges we faced, P2 is a really good result, and so the mood this week is really one of happiness and relief at having delivered that P2. Now we can move on to putting all of our energies into going one better next year. So what's going to happen at the factory during this winter break, and what's happening to the W14 now that the season's over? Well, the W14 doesn't get to enjoy its retirement quite yet. First, it's got a post-season test in Abu Dhabi, then it's heading to Magny-Cours for some Pirelli testing. After that, it will join our Heritage collection, where it will be well looked after and ready to come out for demo runs in the future. In terms of the factory, there's no such thing as a winter break. The winter period is actually often the busiest time. Many people in the factory have been focusing on next year's car for months, and now that the racing's over, the focus can switch entirely to that, and it's all hands on deck to get the car ready ahead of pre-season testing and the first race next year.